Peter, how you doing?
Great. I got to say, I don't know if you know, I'm an astronautical engineer,
Yep.
right? So, like, this is heaven.
Yep.
And you can turn off the clock now. We're going to geek out for about the next 2 hours. I got lots of questions. Can we pick up where you were?
Absolutely.
So, the future of space flight, okay, has been very controversial in the last year. You're a NASA official, so I won't ask you to either take an official or unofficial position vis-a-vis the controversies that have developed in the last year over space flight. But
I'll be happy to do that. I'm in trouble all the time anyhow.
Oh, okay, well then I will put you on the spot. So George Bush had a vision. No, he had a plan. Not really. He had sort of a plan, but not willing to fund it. And so NASA rethought it, came up with a new plan. What do you think of the new plan? The new plan involves going to asteroids rather than the moon, involves a different rocket to get there, no longer the shuttle-derived Constellation rocket, perhaps a different capsule to get there, and a different time frame. What do you think of the new plan?
Well, being in this environment we're talking about, long-term thinking, over the last few decades I've seen an evolution of thought, and I think there's great progress there. That the human space program is now really aimed at settling another world. I mean, 20 years ago, you had to whisper that in, dark bars or get fired. Now it's an open, thing you can talk about. So that's great progress. The problem is that as we started to contemplate that, and I served at I guess it's embarrassing, I served for the first Bush administration in the White House. And I was the staff officer for the first Moon-Mars initiative. And the idea of each...
Which Bush?
Bush 1.
Bush 1. Yeah. Different Mars initiative than we were talking about a moment ago.
It's another question. Bush 2 fired me personally, so I was... But,
that's a mark of honor, isn't it?
That's it. It is, actually. That the idea was that now that we've gotten that embedded, and each administration has moved a little further on that, the idea was we would rebuild Apollo. And that's a great idea, but we don't have the money to do that. And so I think this president very wisely said, look, we got to take a different approach. We're scientists and engineers, let's invent a new way to do it. And he had 2 key points. And the first point was we need to turn over to the private sector. And that's kind of your area. Getting to low Earth orbit, and we're seeing people that now can launch rockets. They build them.
You're a fan of Falcon?
Falcon 1, Falcon 9. They made billions of dollars in the internet, and they all want to go to space. That'll save us a lot of money. And then what NASA needs to do is to do the other 2 things we need to settle. One is how to get to another world, and that's a different thing. The way to do that is to build a true spaceship. And I think probably electric propulsion, probably using solar energy or maybe nuclear energy. That'll take us between worlds. I mean, anybody that watches science fiction knows they don't just build a starship and go once. You build a true ship and you go between worlds. That's the thing that they wanted to start building. And then the third thing is how do you live in another world? Now, I don't have the slightest idea how to do that, although I think things like synthetic biology have a lot of potential for that. That rather than trying to make an environment on Mars like Earth, why don't we modify life? And so it's better suited to that, and I think that's going to happen. Of course, it begs the issue about the human genome. I suspect that when people settle another world, they'll modify that as well. But that's what the new program was. Now, unfortunately, NASA has survived for decades in being a jobs program, and so there's tens of thousands of jobs in some key southern states that have very senior members of Congress, and they had their say, as they should. And so now we're kind of in a compromise. We're kind of half doing some of the Apollo programs. But I think the good news on this is there's a high premium for inventing new ways to do these things affordably, and I think we're started on the right path. So that's what we had our 2-day kumbaya session over. But I'm an optimist.
Well, they cut some of the budget for the privatization of space, which I didn't appreciate,
Yep.
I must say. I thought that was a mistake. On the other hand, the idea of going, say, to one of the moons of Mars as a first step before going to Mars, because it's much easier to get to, say, Deimos or Phobos rather than to land on Mars and get back up. That seems more plausible.
Well, you've actually hit the nail on the head, and and I have to confess to be guilty to sort of conspiring with various people to get the asteroid and moons of Mars in there. If you are building a true spaceship that doesn't have to land on a world, it's a lot cheaper. So the intervening steps are these islands in space, the asteroids, and then eventually getting to the moons of Mars. Now, one of the curious things about Mars is there may be extant life there. And that's why I think it's essential that we don't just land on Mars. The moons of Mars are a good place to research that, plus they're littered with Martian material. But if there is life there, we need to be very careful. I mean, and this, I'm told, this is, if you're a conservative, you're worried about it killing us. If you're a liberal, you're worried about us killing it. You know, I'm told when you mix life from two different areas, usually one kills the other. So we need to be very careful on this one. So I think the way to do that is to go to the moons of Mars, where we can actually do extensive telerobotic exploration of the planet. But it's exactly what I think we'll do. We'll probably be on the moons of Mars around 2030 or so.
That sounds plausible. So you touched on something that has interested me. When I was an engineering student, and my degree is in astronautical engineering, rocket propulsion, we all expected by now some form of propulsion that would make it relatively low cost and easy to get to orbit, and even more powerful form of propulsion to get us to other worlds. Not yet talking stars, but just moon, Mars. Any prospects for significant improvement of ground to space and space to space?
Well, being the Silicon Valley Center director, yes. In fact, we have a young scientist that we're funding to do microwave thermal propulsion. If you can, and this has been for quite a while, the idea if you can beam power to the spaceship, so you don't have to carry all the fuel, and then you use that energy from a laser or a microwave to heat a propellant, it gets you a pretty big factor of improvement. I think that's one way of getting off the world. I mean, there's more exotic ways of, you know, giant cannon and so on, but it's kind of hard for a human to survive on those. But the other one, of course, as I alluded to, is electric propulsion. I mean, anybody that watches, you know, the Enterprise sees this kind of glowing stuff. They don't see like huge plumes of fire coming out the back. So I mean, we all know how it's done. But we're getting there, and that technology is coming along. I think within a few years we will see the first prototype of a true spaceship that'll take us between worlds. And those are major improvements. You know, as you know, the fundamental unit of measure is a specific impulse. And if you burn stuff together, you get, you know, the specific impulse of 400 or so. And kind of roughly it says that, you know, you get 400 pounds of thrust for a pound of fuel. And a electric propulsion things can get up to 10,000. So, and the technology is coming along. So I'm quite optimistic of both getting off the planet and getting between worlds is going to happen in the next few decades.
Well, Stewart and I worked on a film many years ago called Deep Impact.
Right.
And there's a little joke in there that most people didn't actually get. You would get it, and some members of this audience, given their history, would get it, which was when they flew out to the comet to smash the comet, they used a Orion rocket, nuclear rocket, to get there. And of course, the significance of that is that the original nuclear rocket project was called the Orion. Freeman Dyson, Esther Dyson's father, worked on it. And the idea was to use nuclear bombs, pop out the back, blow it up, and propel yourself into space, and on in deeper space on a column of nuclear explosions.
Well, you know, that I'm really intrigued by that. In fact, Freeman's son, George Dyson, has written a book about it. And it's a fabulous book. And
Project Orion.
And it would work, and it will work. The interesting thing I think it's in that book was the reason that got terminated was that when NASA wasn't interested in it, because we chose the German approach, the Air Force took over that, and the Strategic Air Command did it. And I think Curtis LeMay was the general in charge then, and so they built a mock-up of a space battleship, you know, that had bristling with weapons, and they took President Kennedy and he showed it to him, and he was so appalled at this thing that he said, "Okay, that's terminated." So I mean, it's unfortunate that sometimes you got to be careful who you show the cool stuff to.
Well, in fact, when I was in Shell, we were partners in General Atomic. And General Atomic was the contractor, the original contractor for this atomic rocket motor. And if you go to General Atomic's offices in San Diego up on Torrey Pines Road, it's a big circle. And the big circle, theoretically, was the size of the base of the rocket that they were going to build, of the Orion rocket.
That's a pretty cool place, General Atomic. But I guess let me ask you a question. As a guy that does both rocket science and business, this model that we have of getting the private sector to do a lot of this, do you think that's going to happen? Absolutely.
I think it's exactly the right model, both at two different levels. One, the kind of, let me say, low-level space tourism that Richard Branson et al. Are pursuing. I think that's exciting, largely because it keeps a kind of sense of frontier open in people's minds. That's number one. Number two, I think the idea of stimulating a private sector, SpaceX et al. We already have a number of other small providers before, Orbital Sciences and so on, that launch small rockets. And the truth of the matter is that it was actually Boeing and Lockheed and North American and those guys, private sector under contract to NASA and Air Force, that were building the big rockets. The problem is that I think the requirements that were established in the old space age, as it were, are not viable in a commercial space age. And so we have to rethink, and I think the problem of Lockheed and Boeing, rethinking is very hard. Yeah. That's why it takes almost a start from scratch, and that's why Elon Musk has actually figured out how to build relatively simple, relatively lower cost rockets that don't have the performance of, say, some of the big rockets, Atlas, Delta, et cetera, that Lockheed and Boeing have been building, but are actually going to be able to deliver what we really need, getting weight into space at a relatively low cost.
Well, you know, I'm very intrigued in this. I have two fairly wealthy neighbors there, you know, Sergey and Larry, and I talk to them occasionally, and they're very interested in space settlement, although they've terrorized my previous boss by telling him that, you know, we're going to send people one way to Mars, which, by the way, I have to say is the right answer, if you send them to settle. They also said they're going to send old people, which I like because I'm getting to that age.
Yeah, I'll go.
I'll go to it.
Count me in.
That's kind of the key area, but I think it's going to happen. I mean, you know, Larry asked me a couple weeks ago of how much it would cost to send people one way to Mars, and I told him about 10 billion, and his response was, "Can you get it down to 1 or 2 billion?" So now we're starting to get a little argument over the price.
Yeah. Well, that's the right answer. One of the other hats that you began with in the conversation was aviation. Yeah. And Ames is one of the big aviation research centers. You've got these giant wind tunnels. One of my privileges when toward the end of its era was my family and I flew on the Concorde. Is the supersonic aviation era over?
Well, yes. I think the enthusiasm is in the other end. And in fact, we've started a heavy lift airship program. If you drive down there, you see some airship hangars. But the Department of Defense is very interested in heavy lift airships, things that could carry hundreds of tons. I think that will revolutionize air transport because it becomes very cheap. It still goes 100 knots, so they're not that slow. But the idea is that you could easily go to Hawaii, for example. You know, most air journeys are at most a couple thousand miles. So you go there overnight. And you get an airship, you have a
cruise liner.
You have a cruise liner, and I think the era of airships is going to come back. In fact, we see one that's based at Moffett flying over right now, and
I'd like to fly it. It's the one form of flying I've never done.
The other thing I think, rather than going faster, is again a lot less fuel, and the other technology is electric engines, and I think that we're close to the technology where you begin to get chemical fuel energy densities in a battery. And once that happens, then I think electric aviation is the next frontier.
So the kind of solar-powered large wing aircraft that we've seen, several variations, Swiss, the Aero Environment version, do you think we'll have kind of solar-powered platforms up there, the equivalent of the alternative to satellites for communication, for observation, and so on?
Absolutely, but I think the real potential of these things is, you know, when you put a Tesla in the air. In fact, Elon Musk has talked to us about that. But is that
Tesla in the air?
So is the technology?
What's that?
I think it's going to happen. It's going to happen very soon. And because we're going to have air transport that doesn't contribute to greenhouse warming. And today, there's about 3 or 4% of the greenhouse gases comes from air transport. But when we look at who flies, it's only Northern Europe and Japan and maybe South Korea and the US. But what's bringing the world closer together is people flying back and forth. And when the rest of the world starts to travel like that, which we're already seeing in China and India, greenhouse gases from aviation will be 20, 30% unless we do something about it.
What's the answer?
Well, I think initially it's things like biofuels. I think we're involved in some cool biofuel things that I got in trouble with my boss over, but that's another story. But I think the long-term answer is really high-density batteries that are powered off ground-based solar grids, so that your airliner stays plugged in overnight, and you get in and it's got an electric engine rather than a chemical engine.
Turning a prop?
Turning a prop or a turbine. Probably some sort of turbine-type engine.
Well, now that would be a really radical vision. These would be quiet aircraft, I would assume. It would really change the nature of flight fundamentally.
I think it's going to happen, sooner rather than later. I think within 10 years we'll have small-scale business-level ones, and within 20 they'll be the airliners. If we don't, I think aviation is through.
Well, now that's a very radically different vision than I think people would have had of aviation a decade or so ago. It was all SSTs, big jumbo jets, and so on. And the idea of slower, bigger, cleaner wasn't on the map.
Well, I'm sure the last time you traveled, you spend, 3 hours getting to the airport and getting on the flight and then fly across the U.S. and it's 5 hours and then you get there and it's 3 hours to get where you're going. So, getting across the U.S. in 2 hours rather than 5, it doesn't really buy you very much. So I think really the human scale of things is going to push us to the slower, efficient, green things that still get you there in a day. If you can get any place in a day, that's reasonable.
So, one final sort of radical question, so we don't have much, just like the alien question from before. So, Stewart and I have talked a lot about this, and I've never been able to get anybody really thinking seriously about this question, except a little bit. There's some people at NASA. So you think about the future of the human species. There are two very, very fundamentally different scenarios. Scenario one is we're stuck in our solar system, and scenario two, we're not. Scenario one, basically, frankly, our solar system isn't really very interesting. We could maybe make Mars a little bit interesting, maybe a moon or two of Titan, but basically, we're not going to hang out on Jupiter or Saturn or Mercury or Venus. So, it's basically not a very interesting place.
I can presage your answer. In fact, we've just started a project with DARPA.
Okay, so
it's called the 100-Year Starship.
All right, so that's the question.
And the idea is we're going to try to set up little mini grants and set up a program that will begin to invest in the technologies that get us in 100 years a Starship. I think it can be done, and we're hoping to inveigle certain billionaires to form a 100-Year Starship fund.
Yes, yes, yes.
And so that's going to start. You heard it here. But I think absolutely we need to build a Starship.
See, you're ahead of us. We talked about this at long now, and I couldn't get anybody to take it seriously. I said, nobody will take this seriously. You're right on target.
DARPA sent me $1 million, and I put $100 grand of our money in, so it tells you the relative budget between defense and us.
All right. Oh, we got 22 seconds. So, on the Starship, are you going to be on board?
I'm not probably going to live that long, but...
oh, well, you might, life extension.
I absolutely will be on board.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, or at least some genes.
Right, exactly.
I mean, wasn't there another Worden who was involved in space
Yes,
flight?
there was.
Yes, so you can pass it on.
A distant relative.
Thank you.